Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below.
Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and reenchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and reenchanting. Today, I'm speaking to you from the historical homeland of the Lenape, the Mohican peoples, and at the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, in a town also known as Hudson in New York, in the midst of the Hudson Valley. It is my great pleasure to bring to this conversation, to this podcast, to our listeners, a dear, dear friend, collaborator, occasional student, and frequent teacher, Reverend Rhetta Morgan. Rhetta is a singing healer, spiritual activist, and interfaith minister. She's been gathering tools for healing, inspiration for over 40 years. Through her gifts of prayer, poetry, facilitation, and sermonizing, she cultivates hope and nurtures connection in her community as a pathway back to belonging and wholeness. She has worked in many different places and organizations. I'm not going to go into all of them, but just to say that she is known for her jubilant tone, her visionary thinking, and her beautiful singing. And I would say also for her powerful ministry and her capacity to tap in to the prophetic imagination. Rhetta, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Peace and blessings. It is a joy to be here with you.
Such a joy, such a joy. We are going to talk today about darkness and the fitting at this time of year, but it's also fitting because darkness, as I have found, is one of the underlying, like how we engage with darkness is one of the underlying metaphors and symbols for how we work with our world. And we're going to actually start, but I'm thinking we could just start with some poetry and some music. How does that sound?
Sounds like perfection.
So I'm going to start with this poem by one of my favorite poets, Rilke, is a German poet. Many of you may know him. And one of my favorite translation of his work by Joanna Macy and Anita Barrows. You darkness, of whom I am born, I love you more than the flame that limits the world to the circle it illumines and excludes all the rest. The dark embraces everything, shapes and shadows, creatures and me, people, nations, just as they are. It lets me imagine a great presence stirring beside me. I believe in the night. And I'm wondering, Rhetta, if you would be willing to sing that same poem to us in song.
Delighted to. You darkness, of whom I am born, I love you more than the flame that limits the world to the circle it illumines and excludes all the rest. But the dark embraces everything, shapes and shadows, creatures and me, people, nations, just as they are. It lets me imagine a great presence stirring beside me. I believe in the night. I believe in the night. I believe in the night.
I believe in the night. You darkness, of whom I am born. And it's such a powerful way of beginning that poem. We are born of darkness, aren't we?
Indeed. Indeed. Of the void, the great void, spaciousness, the eternal, that intersection of the form and the formless. We're born in the mystery. Yeah, all of that. In the night, in the darkness. Yeah.
And the womb is a dark place.
Say more.
Well, there is no light in the womb. There is only sound and darkness. The sound is palpable in the womb. The sound is the fluid of the womb. Makes so that sound, the experience of healing is experienced as touch. And so the darkness would have, in the womb, the darkness would have been closely associated with feeling and with being held and protected and carried, like literally carried.
Literally, yeah, wrapped in, just covered. The memory of that is probably what causes our great existential crises or anxiety, right? The loss of that sense of being held and to be moved from the darkness, which is a kind of love and a kind of embrace, to the darkness that could be a kind of alienation, aloneness, right?
Well, there's literal separation at birth.
Yeah. From one darkness, the darkness that is beauty and warm and nurturing, to the darkness which is cool and unfamiliar, right? And a different set of qualities. Yeah.
The darkness has so many different qualities.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And life itself, the actual formation of life on this planet. So far as we know, some of our best current scientific knowledge is that life itself started in the depths of the ocean, where the volcanic eruptions was spilling into the ocean floor, and it was not really a place of light.
Mm-hmm.
Heat. There was heat.
Yeah.
It would have been a warm darkness, most likely. But when all those microbes are formulating, they're formulating in a place of darkness. So life literally does come from the dark.
Yeah. So the image that comes to my mind and heart is that the dark was and is pregnant.
Like almost like this inherent, do you feel like there might be an inherent pregnancy in the dark?
Yeah, like maybe an actual quality of the dark is pregnancy, or certainly the potential for pregnancy. Yeah.
The potential, yeah. The potential for creativity and giving birth. You know, that takes me back to some sacred stories about the dark as well, some different mythological, different sacred traditions. And most famously in American culture, of course, is Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
God, the face of the divine, moves over the deep, moves the face across the deep. And that is a time before there was light.
Mm-hmm.
So that initial movement of spirit is happening in the dark.
In the dark, rumination, that awakening, a process of maybe being super conscious of all, everywhere, and everything, to the moment that God intends a different kind of aliveness that ends up with us billions of years later, right? That initial idea, that spark, which is why I think all of the wisdom and mystical traditions are so important in this instance. There aren't words for that, but the great poets and the spiritual traditions give us stories to hold the unspeakable, right?
There's so much that you just said there. We could spend an entire podcast unpacking what you just said. But this sense of that first thing you were saying about to have awakening in the dark, because in our contemporary society we associate awakening with light and with daytime, and yet the awakening you're speaking of is not being able to literally see clearly. Mm-hmm. It's an awakening to a sense, a felt sense,
yes,
of a consciousness.
Yes, and that comes first.
So that the feeling,
mm-hmm.
the experience, the embodiment of creation and the capacity for creativity and the movement is happening in darkness and even through darkness.
Indeed. I think it's a good a place as any to start. Right? Those kinds of concepts, and they feel there's resonance there for me, for sure. Right?
I'm wondering what in that resonates with your own story.
Such a great question. So when you ask about my story, what comes to mind is my relationship to this work and to the darkness. I have a very early memory, I want to say 6 or 7, of lying in bed. The mama's put us all to sleep, and everybody else is snoring, or they look very comfortable, in their sleep. And I often would lie and fall asleep after my sisters and brothers, thinking about, wondering, where does my mind go? What happens to me when I'm not conscious of what's going on when I'm asleep. Now, at 6, I wouldn't use those words, right? But I was just very curious, like, what is going on here? And particularly anxious at that moment of sort of losing consciousness. I would make myself stay awake to try to be aware of going across that threshold into sleep, And it began a fairly anxious relationship with the dark and the night, even that early. I would say in the last 10 years, I've worked enough through and am continuing to work enough through so that the darkness is teaching me, the night, the darkness is teaching me. And those are the things I like to share with other people. But back in those days, there was a sense of wonder about the dark and the feeling of the dark. Now, I will say that I had a huge imagination. And when the lights went off, we always had rugs that had like designs, and the designs would start to dance around like the kind of night. I felt like there was movement in the room, and then the shadows, I thought they were moving. So it had both the qualities of the deep quiet, but also that there was something to be concerned about in that deep quiet. So amongst all of that, I think was also this intuitive feeling that beyond the anxiety, there was something vast, maybe unknowable with my mind. Like even as a little kid, I had a sense of that. Yeah.
A sense of vastness. It's interesting when you share that. That early, I also remember feeling that sense of this great beyond, beyond myself, beyond my house, beyond. Yeah. And that is the thing about darkness, right? It encompasses everything.
Yes.
In a way that the light's always like it's different.
Yeah. It illumines. For some of us, there are ideas around safety or knowing, like when the light comes on. If we have an anxious relationship with the dark, when the light comes on, that's a kind of information, and that information, I think, has influenced our language around the dark and the light, has influenced that the sense of the light being the moral North Star, the thing that we use to guide us. I think that comes out of when the light is on, we can see there's a kind of knowing associated with the light being on. And that has very much been a guiding force, I think, for many of us, our culture. And then the other side of that is the dark in language, in religion, in many quarters. There's this projection of less than, the opposite of light, light as good, the opposite being light as not as evil or sinister, or and certainly the possibilities of both, if not the actuality. So yeah.
There's the light is associated with goodness, and the dark is associated with evil.
Yeah.
In this very dichotomy way, which is in many ways unfair to both light and dark.
Absolutely. As I do this work, as I sort of peer into my own understanding, my own heart, and really challenge the ways I've held the two, I've looked at when there is too much light, there's the qualities that we place in the dark in terms of evil. We can find that when we have an overabundance of light, harshness, the possibility of being burned. Think of that as like way too much knowledge gets us in trouble, or too much of certain kinds of knowledge, right? That knowing that light, when the light is extra bright, it becomes dangerous, right? And so I think if we look at the dark in a similar way, if we look at the dark as the possibility of things that go awry, but also be willing to look at those positive qualities, the regenerative qualities of the dark, the healing qualities of the dark, the fact that gestation happens in the dark. There are all these amazing things. Stars sparkle in the dark, and there's this incredible sort of marriage of the light and the dark, where there's so much beauty. And I would dare say probably access to a kind of wholeness that neither the light or the dark can really provide us. They are both sort of doorways in that direction.
Yeah. Right. And the night is not a completely dark thing. The night is, the stars and this moon, and there's candles and creatures that have eyes, can have better sight in the dark. And there's many creatures of the dark who have a different sense of sensory capacity. And they have I think of the dark as just, it's different, right? If we're being completely clear. But I think part of what I hear you speaking to here is not just the importance of a sense of wholeness with light and dark, which is obviously important, but the importance to be aware of what we are projecting onto the dark as well as onto the light.
Absolutely. And it feels to me an important time to sort of feature the dark here, because I think we've spent a lot less time and energy really exploring it, getting to be at home in the dark. But absolutely for both, right? If we are aware, if we are mindful, if we build capacity to really pay attention to how we use language around darkness, I think that that will reveal some things to us as individuals, interpersonally, and then looking at institution and at a cultural level. Like it was maybe several years ago that I noticed a correlation or a pointing from how we project onto the dark and racism, like the ways in which we are, as a culture, afraid of Black and brown people, or qualities of the feminine, and in terms of if maleness is the sun, then the moon is the dark. There are qualities of femininity as well as, I'm speaking of a sort of my own traditional understanding of femininity, how fabulous that is shifting and growing and expanding in these times, right? But yeah, there is definitely, I believe, some correlation between our fear of Black and brown people and our fear of the dark, or the ways we project, what has grown into, I think, unconscious kinds of fear about the dark, about the unknown, and to some extent about the night, right? They're not, I use them pretty interchangeably, but I want to acknowledge that there's differences, as you mentioned, between the dark and the night. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just thinking historically in our work in my work in researching around colonization, mm-hmm. It was very purposefully done. That was not, random. Mm-hmm. Like the white colonial European, very purposely in the racial metric in which the African person who was turned into a slave, who was forced into slavery, and the European person who gave himself a title, like who became the person who enslaved others. Mm-hmm. They put that Black, white, good, dark, light, that they bring those two things together in a way that had not happened to this extent. Not that hadn't happened before, but hadn't happened to this extent. And then that had global ramifications, right? In terms of racism, skin color, ethnicity, but also in terms of the economic, political, and institutional structures that followed that. It was a very, very purposeful dichotomy that was created of white versus black, light versus dark, good versus bad, set of dichotomical systems. And you can trace that, how that actually occurred historically. And it's been extraordinarily, obviously hugely, hugely detrimental. And I'm kind of curious, in your work and in your experience, how has your understanding of darkness shifted? And how have you come to relate to darkness differently?
Mm-hmm. Well, a thing I want to name is how the white folks that went over to Africa were able to sort of back up or sustain that sense of self-righteousness with scripture. Right, the Bible was used, right, and that scriptures were found specifically around slavery, but the way the language in the Bible talks about the light and the dark, and right and wrong, and so there's a way in which the Bible could be interpreted. I have no doubt that I don't believe that was initial. Purpose of it, but it was certainly usurped. It was used, interpreted in such a way to support the systems of slavery and to thereby support the continuation of traumatizing and devastating people, but also to use that as a basis for the economic systems, like the religious implication is woven in all of the systems of empire. They really are woven into the system, and which is
deeply interwoven to such an extent that even today we're not always conscious of it.
Not conscious of it, and it's why I believe a spiritual exploration, understanding, getting into the conversation of race from a spiritual standpoint is so deeply important because of how deeply and if we talk about a spiritual understanding, we may not be talking about the same thing as religion and dogma, those kinds of things, but they're related enough that I think there's a different way in, and we need all the ways in, right? We need all the ways that people are working on racism. Folks like Dr. King and others certainly brought us that spiritual component into social justice work. I think my work lends itself to almost a more purely spiritual exploration, at least in the work. And the idea, the implication is that we are transformed in such a way that that's now going to impact the social justice work that we do in the world. It's like adding dimension, in that doing that deep inner spiritual work adds dimension and impacts the way we do our own work for justice. As I work to return the innocence to the dark, right, to delve beyond the projections and find that innocence, the place where it's the holy dark, is as holy as any light that we celebrate, right? The other side of that is that many unspeakable things happen in the dark, right? And so when we talk about, pulling these pieces apart, we have to name that. We have to look at that as well. And that is also true for me. There's lots of traumatic experiences that I had in the dark. And so my own healing journey, which has been, I would say, the center of my ministry and my own teaching, all of my work is my own healing journey. That experience, especially early on, is held by the dark. And the dark that I'm going to point to is the unknown, right? Is to walk through, to know that I'm in a lot of pain, and I'm in pain because of both what happened and how I interpreted what happened, but not knowing at that time how many extraordinary healing modalities that I would come to know, how many people on the journey whose hearts I would get to walk with for a while on the journey of healing and learn to love, learn to respect, how many kinds of relationships with individuals, with organizations that would grow into the love I have for our capacity to heal, for our heart's resilience, for the extraordinary power of creativity in that journey, right? So I would say that I have been in relationship with the dark as the unknown, and that how that has changed and is changing is with every layer of healing, something is revealed to a point where I move from the anxiety of that 7-year-old to a kind of intimacy that I want to believe that St. John and others talk about at the mystical level. Now, I can't know that because I'm certainly not in the running to become a saint, but just the beauty and the vulnerability, the deep, deep love and gratitude that I have gotten to practice in my own process of unlearning and being the spaciousness to experience and learn, a whole different language and embodiment and perception, those kinds of things about the dark. So yeah, I've had an incredible experience of, what I mentioned about, being in the womb, being loved, being held, and then being born, and being possibly feeling isolated, but we come out into the coldness of the world. And I feel like I've had, that experience like the other way around, that being a sense of aloneness or the kind of despair, existential angst, right? And through healing work and being called by an unseen consciousness, heart, hand, like being led through that sense of being alone into the warmth in the heart, almost like back into a different kind of womb, That's how I feel now. And that's not all the time, every day, but as practice, individual spiritual practice, being able to share in community, teaching, so that I'm building this muscles, familiarity with those qualities of warmth, of love, of compassion, of a sense of not being alone. Like, right, I get to build those over many years. So yeah, so my relationship with the dark is still growing, but it's an incredible sort of. I grew up in the Black Baptist church. It's an incredible testimony, we would say. Have a testimony of coming through, what some may think of as the unspeakable, and to find a sense of triumph in what's possible by the ways I've been in relationship with the dark and darkness.
Mm. That's just so beautiful. I mean, what I'm so much of what I'm hearing as the testimony is a testimony to the multiplicity and the wonder that is possible in the dark. You talk about going to the dark as both a place of pain and wounding and a place of healing, a place of anxiety and a place of intimacy, a place of beauty and a place of ugliness,
yes,
a place of vulnerability and a place of strength, a place of unlearning and a place of relearning,
beautiful,
a place of separation and a place of connection, a place of isolation and a place of being held, a place of cold and a place of warmth, a place of loneliness and a place of togetherness.
Beautiful. And I would add to that, a place where there's the unseen, but also that the darkness shines, the darkness radiates. So just like we have that.
A luminous darkness.
A luminous darkness, right? When we awaken, as we started, this idea that God awakened in some ways right before the first spark of light, maybe at that moment before the universe was born, right? This moving around, right? And so as God awakens, there's a luminous quality to the darkness becoming embodied, enlivened, right? So the dark has its own qualities of luminosity.
Mm. When you were sharing, I find myself thinking of how much, both as a child and now, I love taking night walks. I love being in the darkness at nighttime. Sometimes alone, sometimes with others, in part because there is some part of me, it's like there's some I sense differently.
Mm-hmm.
I experience differently. I taste, I smell, I hear, I see differently.
Mm-hmm.
And there is often a heightened sensibility. Sometimes there's a little bit of fear, sometimes not, depending upon how familiar I am with physically where I am.
Mm-hmm.
And what might be going on in that space.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this sense of almost a radically different set of possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
My partner was sharing with me this morning about how in the daytime, in the old times, in the daytime, people could get upset at each other, or they could fight, or they could argue, they could have conflict. But at night, everyone gathered around the fire. And they gathered around the fire in part because you didn't want to be alone in the darkness. It was literally not safe, often.
Mm-hmm.
It was literally a place of fear. And you wouldn't want to push anyone into the darkness. Not really.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fire would become the place where people would gather and where many of the conflicts of the day would be worked out.
Mm-hmm.
And in the darkness, there came a time for healing.
Mm-hmm.
And like you, I too have the darkness is where I experienced violence,
Mm-hmm.
like literally in the darkness. And in the darkness is where I experienced a lot of confusion about what was okay and what was not okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the darkness was also a place of a sanctuary for me. So growing up, I experienced both. And I think that today it can be both. I can both be terrified of the dark and I can find deep peace and sanctuary in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the notion of us being able to respect the dark, both parts of it, to respect all of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Sometimes, initially, the emotion of fear is a survival mechanism, right? If we're afraid of something, often there's information, often there's something to be afraid of. Certainly we're thinking of, folks in the early days before all the light and so-called sophistication of, the modern world. If you're in the dark and, if you're in a village or you're out in the field and you sense that there's an animal that, maybe does not want your companionship, that fear is purposeful. It means to get away, find some safety. And so fear in this place of survival is very, very useful, right? So if you're in the dark and there's something specific to be afraid of. Or, if like we know that lots of things happened in the dark, right? So there is an area, there's a place, both physically and internally, there are places where that fear of the dark is real and true. And there is a certain amount of courage, the possibility of courageously facing, what was so or what is so. So that experience of fear can be transformed. And then there is the healthy respect of what is to be afraid of if you're in it, right? It's a spectrum. It's not like one way to be with either the dark or the light. There's a spectrum of paying attention to what is so. It's like being in relationship to, because in some ways it's not so much about a list of qualities or, a book, self-help book about how to be at home in the dark, right? It's about being present so that you can access in that moment what is to be said, heard, listened to, released, respected, or challenged, right? It's about, how present how alive, how awakened can we be to the dark, as we've spent so much time in relationship to the light? Can we spend enough time so that we can pay attention to, if the fear comes up, we have a sense of, what message are we being given? What is to be done? And something about cultivating intimacy and a healthy sense of awe and respect probably shifts our experience of fear in some ways that we may not be able to know until we've done that work, right?
Yeah, and that a shifting that experience of fear so that we're not always afraid of being afraid.
Yeah.
Right. So it can be okay to be afraid.
Yeah.
And we don't have to relegate fear as bad. But sometimes worth paying attention to, and at least worth inquiring into.
Absolutely.
And what's actually coming to me, I don't know that I've ever really thought about this until what you were just saying in quite this way, is certainly we describe spiritual, and this is part of the challenge, we describe spiritual enlightenment as becoming more and more, like literally enlightened, is coming more and more into the light, right? And yet, when I think about presence, I think the times when I feel present, when I'm in the darkness demands of me to be present. Because I can't see well. So I have to become more aware of my surroundings. And if it's light, I have to practice presence. Because it's very easy for me to just listen to the babble in my head. If I'm thinking about taking a walk where I live, right? Or being with somebody else outside. If it's dark, I pay so much attention. And it's like what, and I think as we're saying, it's not about the darkness is good, right? We're not saying that either. We're not trying to completely shift by changing it. It's not from going from one extreme to another. It's actually finding something different.
Yeah.
Which is not the same as a reaction against. Actually finding a different pathway in which we can move into a greater inquiry into what's actually going on here.
Yeah, I love what you just said. So I talk about the holy qualities of the dark, right? To sort of contradict
of the dark,
right? But sort of to contradict the projections onto the darkness. But I love what you just said, in that ultimately it's about an opening, right? So that we get to discover in being present what is so, when we are there, right? It's not so much the tradition of sort of writing or the experience of light in the same way. Or I will speak to, my own experience of light. The dark asks something different of us. I think you spoke to that as well. Another thought was, the two thoughts came to mind. One is, I don't know a lot about this practice, but I've heard about the vision quest, right? When someone goes out in a place, often in nature, and have to contend with the dark. And I'm imagining that they have to contend with their concerns about the dark, and that if they are able to quiet themselves and attune and listen in, that they get the extraordinary experience of going past that threshold of their fear into a whole realm where there is wisdom, you get to have a relationship. As I say, I don't know a lot about it, but I'm imagining some of that may be so. So there's one idea, that vision quest. The other side of that is, we talked about a little bit this idea of colonizing the night or the dark, right? And places where it's naturally beautifully dark, and people come and then we light up the noise of the light in the quiet of we invade the quiet of the dark with the noise and brashness of a light of a modern culture. And sadly for us, we lose the synchronicity of cycle, of being able to both be in the deliciousness of the day and the extraordinary qualities of the night, right? We actually lose out on both by getting out of sync with the cycles of light and day, night and day.
Yeah. I love thinking into to draw it to what is it that we are projecting, and this question you're bringing up around colonizing the dark, how we colonize the dark. Mm-hmm. It's so critical, I think, in these conversations about darkness and light, to not only recognize that these are two of the biggest symbols, day and night, dark and light. These are two of the biggest symbols that humans work with, and as such, they are thick symbols. They are symbols that have layers and layers and layers of meaning upon them, within them and around them, and that have shifted innumerable times across cultures. And the depth of the ways, so to the extent that many cultures have associated light with good and dark with bad, which I want to do more research into that. I think I said earlier that that's very common cross-culturally, and I actually I'm wanting to do a lot more. I want to dig into how common that is cross-culturally. I'm not sure. To the extent that the colonizer used that for the purpose of colonization is itself, I think, a form of spiritual violence, because you're using something that's very deep in many cultures, i.e. associating light with good and dark with evil. And then you're using that for the purpose of creating a racist structure, a structure of systemic racially informed violence is, I think, a form of spiritual violence.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because I often have thought, what will allow a group of people to sustain the kind of, traumatizing a different group of people, like they were able to sustain that and do that over, several hundred years. Like what could, that race, the colonizers, what on earth did they experience that gave them the capability of sustaining that kind of trauma? And so I think about, it must have been incredible, devastation and in the form of violence, just repeated over and over again among the Europeans. And you see that in the old movies, the Renaissance, the Baroque movies, all throughout European history, early history, all of that fighting and cutting off the heads and, just vicious stuff ingrained in people. It's really something. So it is, I think, a kind of violence. Absolutely. The other thing I want to mention is, I don't know that the particular ways that the Christian Bible was used, I'm not so sure that's commonplace. I think of some of the older traditions, Buddhism, the religions outside of the Abrahamic traditions. I'm not so sure that they were used in the same way. So that would be an interesting exploration, I think, to see what's there.
It's something I want to come back to. I think it's difficult for us today. We're so used to electronic gadgets and our phones and having a flashlight available to us at all times. Mm-hmm. The advent of electricity and the many uses that we continue to put it to today is such that we have really, really, really changed the dark. Our experience of darkness is not what it was for most of human history. Yeah. That I'm very certain about. Mm-hmm. And so we have very little experience of darkness. And we certainly have very little experience of night. It's often rare that people have seen the Milky Way. We don't know what our galaxy looks like with our naked eye. We can recognize it on a television screen better than we can if we ourselves are looking at it. We have lost in so many ways. We have lost the night. Mm. And I think that to some extent we have the extent to which we use, and this is not an anti-electricity thing. I'm not trying to go that extreme. I'm just acknowledging the extent to which we have used electrical light in our cities and in our highways and with everything has made it so that we have lost much darkness. Mm. That is not a positive thing.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that being in the dark, cultivating a relationship gives us access to something different, and I believe that something different is important information in terms of the things that we need to think, do, say, be in terms of the challenges that we are facing. Like we don't have access to all of that we could bring to try to solve the dilemmas we're in. Mm-hmm. And I think that our lack of relationship to the dark holds some stuff that we need, that holds some information, holds some connections. There's some things we aren't going to be able to figure out because we don't have enough connection to that thing we're trying to figure out, right? And so that relationship to intimacy with the dark, it speaks to something that we can't put in our mind and solve. We don't even know we don't have it because it's not a mental thing. That the embodiment, which includes the vulnerability, which includes the qualities that awaken when we're in relationship with the dark. We don't have access. And I want to put creativity in that category. We think of the Great Awakening, the first spark of awakening in the universe. That is the moment that the creative comes to alive or awareness, right? And so we don't have our creativity. When we say we lose the night, we are out of communion with part of our own beingness in terms of creativity. We are out of communion and parading around like we think we know because we got all of these books and scholarship, which the mind can go on and do its own dance, you have its own parade with part of itself missing, So we're too smart for our own good. Some of the, from my Christian background, I left a lot of it, but that property of humbleness, I think, is a thing that is just we could really use some of that. Like, what awe inspires within us is spaciousness, and spaciousness means that we have room for something other than what we already know. So yeah. So you said a lot when you say that we've lost a night. We've literally, it's like losing a limb. Well, you know how they talk about the phantom limb, right? We've lost an essential part of ourselves, and are in the experience of the impact of that loss.
Mm. Mm. Oh. Yes. We're coming towards the end of our time together in this amazing session with Reverend Rhetta Morgan. You can find out more about her work at www.reverendrhetta.com. And there will be many opportunities. We've spoken with her before around spiritual midwifery. We're going to be speaking with her again, and hopefully we'll be offering more around this topic in particular. As a closeout, I know both of us, we both think a lot about not just sort of these big topics, but also some very concrete, tangible things that people can do. And I'm wondering if you have one or two exercises or questions that you like to offer people as they engage with darkness differently.
Well, thank you for that. First, I want to say how wonderful it's been to spend this time with you and to have time to play in the field of your beautiful mind. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been wonderful. I would say some questions that I have been sort of working with and I offer is one is, what are some of the challenges you have around the dark or in the dark? What is challenging for you about the dark? Any of those questions that resonate. And to be willing to look at that and to explore it, to be curious about it. And if you don't have all the answers right away, I'd like to say, be willing to sit in and with the questions, because they will work on you and work with you, right? And then another question to ask is what treasures have you received from the dark, right? So you get to look at the places that have been challenging or may be challenging, but also to really appreciate what the dark has given you that has been restorative, healing, insightful in a very different kind of way, or whatever might emerge from you or for you. By sort of holding that question as well. And also to be willing to be with the question, right? It's almost, the mind may answer one way, but it's being willing to ask the question, maybe listen from your heart or listen to your body, right? To be willing to gather together information, maybe in a slightly different way than maybe you usually do. And be willing to receive richly, because I think they are questions that have the possibility of offering some very meaningful wisdom.
That's so great, because you actually, in offering people something about the dark, you offered people, how do you engage with the questions themselves? And that, to me, is in itself something that we gain in part through darkness. To learn how to ask and receive, to ask a question to our higher selves, to our inner selves, to the divine guidance that we receive, and then how to ask the question, how to receive an answer. That is to enter the space that is not visible. It is a space of darkness. And I would actually say, given what you just said, that part of the gifts of the dark are to learn how to become a better seeker, to learn how to seek with all of our senses. And also, as you were talking, I was thinking about something you said earlier about that creative spark and the role of darkness and creativity. If we think about how a seed forms, the seed and how the tree grows, for example, the seed spends a fair amount of time orientating itself underground before anything comes above ground. And that time before something emerges above the ground, the time when the seed is in darkness, that is a very creative time. Mm. That is a time that enables the rest of the creativity to occur. Mm-hmm. And it's so for those of you who take our circular time courses, you'll know that one of the questions I always invite people to kind of inquire into is, where was a seed planted? And how long did it stay dormant? How long did it stay underground before you began to see how it was beginning to grow? Because often we have an idea, or we are starting something, or we know something, we begin to percolate. It percolates. It stays in the darkness growing before it comes out. Mm-hmm. And that gestation process is often overlooked and diminished in a culture that seeks fast results. So that question, especially helpful with circular calendars in terms of answering it. Where are seeds planted? And how long is your gestation process for different projects or different things you're engaged in, your creative process? And then the other invitation is simply to spend some time sitting in the dark. And I think that can be a warm darkness. It can be covered by blankets in your bed, or in some other place that's warm and dark. It can be a cold darkness outside. You get different things in different places. It can be a warm darkness outside if you happen to live in a climate where that's possible. But let you time yourself for 20 minutes, no electricity, no beeping lights in the corner of your bedroom. Just the dark. What, how, who emerges or doesn't emerge.
And I'll throw in at the end, bless the dark.
Bless the dark. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much. Indeed. Bless the dark.
Thank you again. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Samanvaya website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.